Hi all, welcome back. This set of lectures is going to concentrate mainly on the endocrine system. And so the endocrine system, for kind of just general purposes, is a glandular system. Okay? So it's going to release hormones. And those hormones can entice different things in the body. We talked about this a little bit before when we were talking about muscle. And you can get certain muscles being associated with hormones. You can get the release or the enticing different regions of the body to potentially grow. You can get a bone growth related to hormone levels. You can get production of new cells in a region. You can get production of sexual tissue, all kinds of things. And so we're going to dive into kind of just general these different systems, and they make up the endocrine system, and we'll kind of dive in there. So first we need to talk about hormones in general. Okay, so hormones come in two major kind of forms, and we'll get to this. They can either be a lipid-based form or kind of a protein-based form. And so they're released into the blood often, but also can be released into extracellular fluid, so fluid in between. Sometimes this would be within, say, the dermal layer or the dermis layer. In between connective tissue, you might get a release of hormones. But often it's carried by the blood system, so by capillaries, veins, to targeted areas. Now, again, back to the type of hormone. So there are two main types. You have hormones that are water soluble. Okay, that means they can dissolve in the liquid form of blood and be transported in blood. Or there's hormones that are what we call lipid soluble or lipid based hormones. Okay, and they can still be carried by the blood, but they're not dissolving in the blood. And how they get into a target cell determines on what type is determined by what type of hormone it is. If the hormone is water soluble, right, then often it cannot travel through the membrane. Okay? If the hormone is lipid soluble, often it can get incorporated into the membrane, and we'll come back and talk about this a little bit more. Okay? A couple things just about hormones in general. Okay? They, in very low concentrations, they can be very powerful substances. The other thing about hormones that make them different than nerves, of course, nerves travel through action potentials. This is a different way of communication, different way of sensory. Hormones typically stick around for longer, or at least they have the capability of sticking around for longer. Nerves tend to fire and then it's done. Hormones are released and you can have a delayed effect, or you can have an effect that might occur for days, weeks, potentially months, depending on the type of hormone. So two general types, okay? You have steroid or steroid-like hormones. Steroid is a type of lipid or a type of fat. Okay, so these would be fat soluble or fat-based hormones. Okay, and so when we're talking about these different steroid hormones, remember if it's lipid. Okay, and so this goes back to just general science. If it's a lipid or a fat, it's insoluble or non-soluble in water. Okay, so just keep that in mind. That makes it useful for tracking things, maybe things like steroids in general, or testosterone, estrogen. other things that might affect performance, and we'll get to performance enhancing drugs and things like that when we in a little bit. Okay, but it's easy to detect those in things like urine or sweat because they don't dissolve in it, and they don't mix. Okay, and then the other are non-steroid hormones, and these can be in many different forms. Normally, they are somewhat protein based, or at least a derivative of a protein. So you can have what we call amines, which are amino acids. Okay, so they're based on amino acids and derived from tyrosine, which is a type of amino acid. So epinephrine, norepinephrine, these other things are associated with it. They can just be proteins in general, long amino acid chains, things like GH or growth hormone. Okay? They can be peptide, which are short chains of amino acid. Again, all these things are related to proteins, and they can be glycoproteins, which means that you could have a carbohydrate, a sugar, attached to a protein. Okay? So again, these are protein based, these are fat based. And those are really the main differences between the two general types. So if we look at the structure of hormones, again, lots of different ways and setups for hormones. Some of these are very familiar or maybe familiar to you, like cortisol or norepinephrine. Okay, we already talked about PTH or parathyroid hormone and its role in regulating bone. Okay, look at this molecule. This molecule is huge. Okay, all these little capsules that are linked together, those are amino acids. And so there's lots of amino acids linked together. This is a very large molecule. Other things like oxytocin, which we talked about a long time ago, and its release during pregnancy and its stimulation of mammary glands, okay, prostaglandins. We'll talk about some of these, but in general, these are just kind of the differences in molecules and how they look. Some are really large hormones, some are very small hormones, and some have to be processed in a specific way. Others are a little bit more universal. So let's talk a little bit about that hormone in action. Okay. So the way that hormones work is they entice some type of activity. Normally it's hormone, receptor, and then you get an action. Okay, and so um, that's based on kind of a metabolic process. It could be a biochemical pathway where the hormone entices one thing to happen, and then that product becomes um, you know, a substrate or a material that fits into another protein, and then on and on and on, and you kind of get this cascade of effects. And we'll talk about some of these as we go. Other times, that hormone might just change the consistency of the membrane. It might allow for the membrane to open up and allow other things to come in, other substances to come in. Okay, but normally what's happening is the hormone will deliver or be delivered to a receptor. Okay, so the receptor itself is going to be, majority of the time, it's going to be on a target cell. When that happens, it can change things inside the cell. Okay, and often what's associated with this is you have a hormone attaches to a receptor that changes something inside the cell, and normally that's the result of something that's going on in the nucleus. Okay, so this is going to entice things like the production of a certain type of messenger RNA, which is going to make a certain type of protein, and then that protein will be used in some way. So like if we're talking about growth hormone, okay, growth hormone is going to entice new formation, especially around bones, new formation of osteocytes and osteoblasts are going to lay down new bone material because of the growth hormone in the region. It's stimulating that action. Okay, and so the number of receptors and how much hormones you have in solution can determine how fast a response goes or how long that response might go. Okay, and so there's a couple different ways at which this can happen. You can have what we call upregulation, where you have a increased number of receptors on a target cell, and in response to a decrease in hormone levels. So you increase how many receptors you have because there's not enough hormones in solution. Or you can have what we call downregulation, where you have less receptors because you might have an increase in hormone levels. All right, let's talk about a couple examples of this. Steroids in general are poor water solubility. Okay, we talked about this. You guys know this because fats don't dissolve in water, and steroid is a lipid. Okay? So they can be transported through the blood, and they can be bound to plasma proteins in the blood, but they're not dissolved in the blood. Right? So that makes them easier to detect and harder to travel in certain regions, maybe a little bit slower to get to certain regions. Depends on the size of the steroid and the thyroid hormone. Okay. What makes them useful, though, extremely useful, is that they can move through lipid bilayers. They can move through the cell membrane. They don't need to have a receptor to travel through the membrane. They can just travel through the membrane. Right? Now, thyroid hormones, they normally insert themselves via a certain transport method. Normally, there's a receptor that allows for the thyroid hormones to enter, but we'll get to this. Okay. In both cases, though, steroid and thyroid, they're going to bind to receptors inside the cell, and that's normally has to do with the nucleus because both of these are going to entice normally messenger RNA strands to be made. So certain strands of DNA are going to be copied into messenger RNA, and then that's going to be transcription, and then later on they're going to be translated into some type of protein. That's normally what these are enticing, and we'll look at some specific examples of this. Okay, so they're going to cause transcription of a particular gene in the DNA, and then that gene or that transcribed piece, which is called messenger RNA, it will be synthesized into a protein. And that's really the action of the hormone itself. The hormone is enticing a certain type of protein to be made. Okay, so we can look at this real quick. So you have this steroid hormone. Okay, whether this be thyroid or just a general steroid, and we'll talk about them, okay, and where they might be produced. Okay, it makes it to a cell, a target cell. It can just penetrate the target cell. It doesn't have to have a receptor on the outside for it to attach and cause some chemical change. So it can just penetrate the target cell. In many cases, it will entice a change in the nucleus. So it might go through the nuclear pore, or it might go through the membrane. Okay. It hooks up with some type of receptor that's inside the nucleus. This is all dependent on what type of hormone it is. Okay. That receptor will allow for the copying of certain chunks of DNA, making a messenger RNA most often. That messenger RNA then leaves the nucleus, gets back into the cytoplasm, and then while it's in the cytoplasm, it can start forming a protein, a specific protein that's associated with that hormone. This is the process of transcription, making RNA strands. Translation is taking that RNA strand and translating it into a protein. Pretty simple stuff. Obviously, some hormones is very complex. There's multiple processes, and maybe this entices multiple different messenger RNAs, which makes multiple different strands of protein that then bind together to form a quaternary or a very large protein that might be needed. Okay, but in simple form, this is kind of the steps for steroid hormone action. Non-steroid hormone action, okay, much better at being dissolved in our blood system so they can travel places, in many cases, much faster. Okay? But when it gets to that target cell, now you have to have a receptor. You have to have a receptor on that cell. And majority of the time, that hormone is not entering the cell. It entices a or triggers a message or triggers a chemical change within the cell, but it itself is just bound to the receptor. And I'll show you a diagram of this. Okay. So when that hormone becomes what we call the first messenger, that changes or leads to a change, okay, which is called the second messenger. That happens inside the cell. And then that second messenger can do the same thing that steroid did. It can entice the messenger RNA to be made, to be translated into a protein, lots of different ways. One of the main hormones, that or second messenger that is created is what we call cyclic adenosine monophosphate, or CAMP. CAMP is very, very general and used often by many different hormones. Okay, and so CAMP is a secondary messenger that often happens inside the cell and then can start that process of whatever is going to happen. Okay, and we call this kind of process of inducing a signal from outside inside. Okay, we call that a signal transduction. Okay, and this is also really similar to how cells communicate with each other cells, how they communicate damage. So if there's a damaged cell, they'll send out a cytokine or a signal molecule. That molecule will make it to a receptor on another cell that will create, say, a CAMP, and then that message will be sent. Hey, we need to start proliferating. We need to start dividing and creating new cells to fill this gap because we got a bunch of damaged cells. Okay? That's all. Those are all called signal transductions. In this case, it's hormone driven. In other cases, it might be driven by damage or temperature, many things. And we already kind of talked about this a little bit before. Okay, so let's look at kind of that non-steroid hormone action. So you got this non-steroid hormone action, can dissolve in water. Okay, it finds a receptor on its cell of or target cell. Okay, that changes the conformation. Okay, normally this is associated with what we call a G protein, but there are different ways at which this can happen. But it binds to a receptor, changes something going on inside the cell, okay, which can entice the formation of other things. And in the case of CAMP, then adenate cyclase is going to be involved, and that's going to change that adenate cyclase to convert ATP into CAMP. And then CAMP can go ahead and do different things. It can entice inactive molecules like a protein kinase to be an active protein kinase. Protein kinase, they typically break down protein molecules. So it's an enzyme that will break down proteins. So if we need to dissolve proteins or deteriorate some proteins in a region, you might have this kind of hormone comes in, entices CAMP. CAMP then activates a kinase, and then that kinase can go and destroy or break down proteins. Okay? We'll look at some specific examples of this later. Okay? So let's talk about that clinical application that I brought up at the beginning. Okay? Everybody wants an edge, and hormones are the way to do it, or at least they have been for a very, very long time. Lots and lots of athletes have abused hormones to get that edge. Okay, steroids, of course, probably one of the most famous ways to do this. Okay? Steroids increase muscular strength. Okay, so the hormone will increase the amount of proteins. It'll increase the amount of energy that goes into the muscle. It helps the muscle heal microfiber tears, and it increases the flow of blood to that muscle. All kinds of things. There are obviously natural hormones that do this. Testosterone is a natural hormone that goes to the muscle and entices muscle growth. Okay, there's lots of ways at which this can be harmful, though. Increasing the steroids. Okay, of course, it can make or individuals who may not produce a lot of testosterone. So if you're a male, you produce more testosterone than a female. If you are a female and you start taking steroids, normally what happens is these steroids increase the amount of testosterone in the system, which changes the features of a female to be more male-like. Okay? The problem that you have in males is a lot of times what occurs is when you're taking supplement steroids, okay, typically they're testosterone-based steroids, then the natural material that you normally produce decreases. Okay, and so you might decrease your natural testosterone. You might decrease regions that are affected by testosterone, might cause like reproductive parts to malfunction and not work any longer. On top of that, a lot of other harmful side effects of steroids are things that have to filter this material out of the blood. Okay, so like your kidneys, your liver, things like that will be overworked, and often you'll have issues with that. Another way to go about this, and it's more used probably more lately than steroids, because once steroids were tested for, which all athletic, or at least professional athletic events probably test for steroids. I shouldn't say all, but majority of them do. Okay, so once they started doing that, other people, they found ways around that. So instead, why don't we use human growth hormone or some other type of growth hormone from a different species that can still entice growth, and this will enlarge muscles and can be used instead of steroids. Again, they're tested for now. Okay. Another one is erythropoietin. Okay. This is a way that instead of enticing muscle growth from a steroid or growth hormones, now you're just increasing how much nutrients and oxygen is delivered to the muscle. So a little different way, still against the rules in most athletic events or professional athletics. And again, though it's hormone based, and another way that you can do this to potentially get a leg up on competition. Okay? All of which have major side effects. I think erythropoietin is probably the worst side effect, in that it can cause heart attack because it can increase the number of red blood cells and oxygen to the region, can cause anemia in other forms or in other regions of the body away from the muscle. You can become anemic. It can also just overwork the heart in general. Yeah, there's some major issues with it. Prostaglandins or prostaglandins. Okay, these are substances that are like hormones, but not not quite the same as a hormone. Okay, again, very potent in small amounts. They can't be stored in cells. And they're typically synthesized just before releasing, and they can activate very quickly and are useful for regulating response to hormones. Okay, so you can inactivate or activate something like adenylate cyclase so you can control that CAMP production that we just talked about. Okay, so if you're producing too much protein kinase, one way is the prostaglandin will inhibit adenylate cyclase, which will then control that CAMP production. There's lots of effects though. Some of the best known effects has to do with smooth muscle, so the intestinal tract, things like that. It also can regulate blood pressure by controlling vasoconstriction and vasodilation. There's all kinds of wide varieties of effects from the prostaglandins, but we'll come back to the prostaglandins in a little while. All right, hormone secretion and effects. So how are they controlled? How are they secreted, etc.? So normally we're talking very precisely regulated. We'll talk about when you have hormone disorders that they're not precisely regulated and what can happen from that. Majority of them have a negative feedback mechanism. So we talked about this a long time ago. Negative feedback means when there's too much in the system, it basically flows back into the system and shuts the system down. So if you're producing too much of a certain hormone, the excess hormone or a product down the line of the biochemical pathway, will fit back into the system and close it down, shut it down, and limit how much is being produced. So it has its own feedback loop. In this case, it's normally called a negative feedback mechanism or negative feedback loop. Okay, we talked about this a little bit before. Okay, they can be very short-lived or they can last for many days. Okay, some of it can be excreted in urine, and so that's one way for it to get out of the system. Is it's diluted by your urine, and then you just excrete it out, or incorporate it in your urine from the blood, moves into the urine and can get excreted out. Other times it has to be broken down by things like the liver. And so they might have to have an enzyme to break down the hormone. Otherwise, it might be able to just be excreted out through liquid waste. Okay, talk about negative feedback again. So negative feedback is the main way and very important way to control hormones and the effects of hormones. Okay, so it's a mechanism in which when hormone levels rise, okay, it decreases the hormone secretion until that hormone is used up, and then the inhibition is stopped and the secretion could begin again. These are cyclic kind of events, and it's not an all or nothing. I don't want you to think, oh, you have too much testosterone in the system, it just closes it down, it shuts it off. That's not true. It slows the process down. It slows the production down. So less is being made. Okay? So there are three main methods of negative feedback. Okay? The hypothalamus, right? It controls the release of pituitary hormones, the anterior pituitary hormones. We'll get to the other portion of the pituitary gland. Those pituitary hormones then can secrete hormones that control activity in other glands. Okay, and we'll come back and we'll look at this. So that's one way. Your nervous system can control it. Okay, so it can directly stimulate glands to secrete their hormones. And then if there's no nerve impulse, that gland's not secreting that hormone any longer. Okay? And then you can have changes in composition of the internal environment. Okay? So you can have specific substances that might be in blood, like glucose, or different types of ions that can stimulate the secretion of a hormone. So if you have lots and lots of glucose in the system, then you might stimulate the hormone insulin to be made, and that would, you know, couple or be coupled with that glucose production. We'll come back and talk about glucose and its role. And then you can have potential positive feedback. Okay? So you can have a mechanism which levels of hormones, rising levels of hormones, increase secretion. Okay, so normally this is reserved for kind of reproductive systems where you got a little bit of testosterone that's enticing reproductive system, and then you kind of get more and more and more. So sperm production is a good example of this. Egg follicles can be an example of this. So you can get a positive feedback where you get a little rise of hormones that leads to an increase in production or secretion. So you can look at kind of how these are controlled. Again, hypothalamus, anterior pituitary gland might make a peripheral endocrine gland, then it goes to the target cell, action. But when that you get that peripheral endocrine gland, this is something else, some other kind of gland. We'll talk about some of them. Okay, its production of whatever the hormone is that it's producing can also fit back in and stop the hypothalamus from producing a hormone that goes to the anterior pituitary gland, or it can stop the anterior pituitary gland from producing something that fits in this system. The nervous system, same thing. Okay, normally though, nervous system will go to action. That action would then trigger the nervous system to basically shut off. So it's not sending that signal anymore because it's already sent the signal. The action's already happened. Okay, same kind of thing with change in the substance. Sometimes this is internal, but sometimes this is just in like the plasma of the blood. Okay, that can entice the endocrine gland to produce a hormone, target cell action, and that action results in no longer needed. So you no longer need that signal to be sent. Now, this is what I was getting at originally. Okay, I want you guys to not think about all or nothing. And we might say, well, the average concentration of a certain hormone. So maybe we say the average concentration of estrogen in this individual's body is this. Well, that's average. The concentration fluxes over time. Okay, it'll go up, and then when it goes up, a negative feedback will cause it to go down. And then when it's down, okay, it will be enticed to travel up because it's too low, and it'll go back up and back and forth. So even within kind of a period of a day, you'll get these cycles. Potentially, depending on the individual, you could get these cycles within an hour. Okay? In a month, these cycles are definitely going to happen depending on the different hormones. So really it matters what type of hormone we're talking about, how long does that hormone last, and what's the effect of that hormone. Sometimes these hormones can be very cyclic over an entire month. Sometimes they can be cyclic over a 24-hour period. But again, this is kind of based on negative feedback control, sometimes positive feedback control, but mainly negative. All right, next time out, we'll talk more specifics about different types of hormones.